Good day. Today is Wednesday, 18th June 2025, and last night all the indicators appeared to suggest that the United States had indeed made a decision to join Israel's attack on Iran. And I'm going to say straightforwardly that though there has not yet been a US attack on Iran, I nonetheless fully expect it to happen at some point over the next couple of days. So let us start firstly with the person who acts as if, or claims to be, the final decision maker in the United States, who is, of course, the President of the United States, Donald Trump. Now, in my program yesterday, I spoke about the incredible succession of messages that Donald Trump posted on the previous day on his Truth Social channel. As I said, one after the other, criticizing Tucker Carlson, criticizing Emmanuel Macron, talking about Iran having failed in its obligations and all of the rest, all apparently leading up, or seemed to be leading up to a decision to attack Iran. If you want an even more structured account of those messages, there's a very, very good written account of them and discussion of them by Larry Johnson on his blog, Sonar 21, in which he goes through them all and talks about the incredibly dangerous escalatory nature of the comments, and says again what I also strongly feel, that it's long overdue that somebody before these messages were published actually took charge of checking them and coming back to the president and telling him, is it really wise to say some of the things that the president was saying? But anyway, yesterday we got a further succession of messages from the president, and they all seem to point in exactly the same direction. And they came thick and fast, one after the other. The first read as follows: We now have complete and total control of the skies over Iran. Iran had good sky trackers and other defensive equipment, and plenty of it, but it doesn't compare to American-made, conceived, and manufactured stuff. Nobody does it better than the good old USA. Well, let's put aside the question of whether the Americans really do have the best defense equipment. I've discussed in recent programs, and increasing numbers of people are discussing this also. There's a fascinating discussion on this very topic by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis and Andrei Martyanov looking into it. Anyway, I've discussed how it's obvious, to me at least, that there are serious problems with Israel's air defense system, that it has not lived up to its reputation, whatever the design philosophies that underpin it. Certainly, at the moment, it is looking less effective than the air defense system which Russia possesses, and which it seems to me has coped with the various attacks by Ukraine on Russia using Western weapons much more effectively. But as I say, let's put that aside. Let's go to the very first word of that message. We now have complete and total control over the skies over Iran. Now let's just wheel back a few days, 10 days or so. We started getting reports 10 days or so, even as the United States and Iran were supposed to be preparing for a meeting of their chief negotiators, Steve Witkoff and Mr. Arakchi, in Oman on the 15th of June, that the Israelis had lost patience and were about to launch a unilateral strike against Iran. And then the Israeli attack on Iran duly began on Friday the 13th of June, on Friday. And the U.S. Secretary of State then said that the attack was a unilateral attack by Israel on Iran, and that the United States was in no way involved. Then, a few hours later, as the reports started to trickle in about the success or claimed success of the Israeli strikes, as I've discussed in previous programs, Donald Trump blew the cover of the whole claim that Israel was acting unilaterally by publishing a whole succession of posts in which he was saying that it was entirely Iran's fault that the Israelis had attacked Iran. The Iranians had failed to take the deal. He never made clear, by the way, what the deal was that he was supposedly offering. As I've said already, there was no deal. There were negotiations and there were proposals from the Americans and counter-proposals from the Iranians, and the Russians were also involved in those discussions, as of course were the Omanis. But it's not as if Donald Trump presented, as far as I know, the Iranians with a complete deal, which they ever formally rejected. He made proposals, but that wasn't a deal. But anyway, let's not get drawn into all of that. Anyway, that, to my mind, blew apart completely the whole elaborate cover story that it was all a unilateral attack by the Israelis upon Iran and that the United States was not involved. And of course, Donald Trump couldn't restrain himself. He went out and he told everybody that he not only knew about the attack in advance, but that he'd had a lot more than just a heads up, and that the attack had happened because he'd given Iran a 60-day ultimatum 60 days before, and the attack took place on the 61st day in conformity with his own ultimatum. So he gave everybody the impression that he owned the operation that the Israelis were conducting. So the fiction that it was a unilateral Israeli attack on Iran, one which had taken place without the involvement of the United States, the claim that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, was himself spreading, and which was published that very same day, Friday the 13th of June, on the White House website. The president himself completely blew that cover story to pieces. And then the hours passed and Iran recovered from the initial blow, and they started to launch missile strikes of their own against Israel. And the missile strikes got through and began to strike and hit targets in Israel. And it became increasingly clear that, contrary to whatever impression Donald Trump might have had, the Israeli attack on Israel had not been the knockout blow that perhaps he expected, and perhaps which the Israelis and others might have told him that it was. So he then began to pivot back, and he published further messages on Truth Social in which he said that the United States had had nothing to do with the Israeli attack on Iran. Apparently, all of his previous messages on Truth Social, we were all required to forget and ignore them, but they're nothing to do. The Americans had nothing to do with the Truth Social, with the Israeli attack. He, Donald Trump, had had nothing to do with the Israeli attack. It was entirely the Israelis carrying out this attack. The entire impression created was that he was trying to distance himself and the United States from an Israeli attack that a few hours before he thought had been a resounding success, and which he had gradually come to realize had fallen far short of that. And now, we now have new comments, and he's gone back on all of that again. Suddenly it is we, not just Israel, but the United States also. We now have complete and total control of the skies over Iran. Shortly after that message appeared on Truth Social, apparently people started to call the White House to ask whether that word "we" on Truth Social had been intentionally inserted there, or whether it was just Trump writing sloppily, as he sometimes does. And apparently the message came from the White House that it was indeed intentional and meant to convey exactly what it said, that the United States and Israel are working hand in hand, and that this is a joint Israeli-American operation. In other words, going back completely on Trump's attempts to revive the discredited cover story, the cover story that he had himself discredited, that the Israelis were acting unilaterally. No longer is it the case that the Israelis are acting unilaterally. The President of the United States now says that it is we, Israel and the United States together, who have achieved complete and total control of the skies over Iran. By the way, that may not be true, as we will discuss shortly, but never mind. Anyway, that was then said, and then a few minutes later, a further comment suddenly appeared. It read that we know, that is to say the United States and presumably Israel, it's just we again, we know exactly where the so-called supreme leader is hiding. He is an easy target, but he's safe there. We are not going to take him out. Kill! ! At least not for now. But we don't want missiles shot at civilians or American soldiers. Our patience is wearing thin. Thank you for your attention to this matter! Another extraordinary message on Truth Social. This a few hours after Prime Minister Netanyahu also spoke about how it'd be a wonderful thing, it would end the war quickly if Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, was indeed killed. And here we see the President of the United States talking, I have to say, like a mob boss. So, you know, we're giving you some element of protection at the moment, but, you know, our patience is wearing thin. If you continue the way you're going, well, we can take you out whenever we choose. We know where you are, and this is what we can do to you. And then a few minutes later, the third Truth Social post in capitals: unconditional surrender! What does that actually mean, by the way? What does Donald Trump actually mean by unconditional surrender? That Iran should give up its nuclear enrichment program, which has been the topic of discussion up to now, that it should give up its entire military forces, that Iran should go through the same process that Germany did in May 1945 and put up the white flag and allow presumably American and Israeli forces to occupy the country and arrest its leaders and establish a new government there. What exactly is Donald Trump thinking when he says those words? unconditional surrender? I mean, is there any real thinking or logic behind these words at all? What does he think that the Iranians are thinking when they read those words? It's widely believed, perhaps correctly, that the Allied demand during the Second World War for Germany's unconditional surrender, which, by the way, I think was entirely correct, just to make this clear, that demand might have stiffened German resistance and prolonged the war. Given what the German leadership had been doing, I don't think that there was any alternative. Just saying. But in this situation, in the situation where Israel has conducted an attack upon Iran, which had not previously been attacking Israel or the United States, or, by the way, any other Middle East country, or any country, what is unconditional surrender more likely to do? The demand for it. Is it not more likely to make not just the political and military leadership of Iran more determined to resist, but is it not also likely to unite further Iranian society behind their leadership in order to resist a demand that their country unconditionally surrender? Is that what Trump is thinking? Is that what he means? Or has he got something else in mind? Well, he hasn't explained. His messages after that Truth Social message have been all about other things, about his high approval rating, about the fact that he's putting up poles to display flags, about things of that kind. Anyway, no explanation of those truly extraordinary and fantastic words. Probably it's just some kind of figure of speech intended to display resolve, but again, words have consequences, and at the very very least, these words are singularly unclear and ill-judged in their probable effect. Anyway, all of that was then supposed to lead to a meeting of the National Security Council, and this meeting duly took place, and of course we haven't yet been provided with clarity about the decisions that were made at that meeting. But there is a claim circulating that the meeting divided, that some of Trump's advisors pressed him to support Israel and to attack Iran, and other of his advisors told him that doing so would be a colossal mistake and that he should pull back. And anyway, that was the last report that I saw. Meanwhile, Donald Trump's vice president, J.D. Vance, who is widely believed to be a skeptic about all of this, apparently sensing the gathering alarm and sense of anger and feelings of betrayal amongst Donald Trump's base, started to publish messages saying that, trying to explain, to rationalize the president's policies, criticizing the Iranian leadership for conducting a nuclear enrichment program, saying that nobody had been able to explain why Iran was conducting a nuclear enrichment program. I'm going to express my own views about that in a moment. And saying basically that he understood all of the concerns that people had given the disastrous forever wars that had happened over the previous 25 years, but basically that they should trust the president on this. I don't get that sense, by the way. I don't get the sense that that message is being accepted, but we'll come to that again in a moment. Anyway, Vance then also had a meeting with Republican senators in which he appeared to try to convey the same message. And according to news reports, and of course I wasn't present at this meeting, but according to news reports, he told the senators that the president still prefers a negotiated route out of this war as opposed to a violent one. In the meantime, even as all these contradictory reports about what happened at this meeting circulate, we get more reports of more American warships moving towards the Persian Gulf, of more U.S. aircraft and military being deployed to the region. And in particular, it seems one USS Navy carrier, the Carl Vinson, is already in this general area in the Arabian Sea, and that another USS Navy carrier, the USS Nimitz, is steaming in that direction from its positions in the Pacific, in the Asia-Pacific region, and is expected to arrive there in the next few days. And since then, over the last few hours, we've had relative silence, though I've seen reports on some Russian telegram channels that the United States has conveyed to the Iranians a message that unless they agree within the next 24 hours to give up completely all nuclear enrichment and their entire ballistic missile program, then an attack on Iran will follow, that the United States will join the attack on Iran. Now that may be true, but I would say that as this comes from Russian telegram channels, I wonder where they're getting the information from, maybe from the Iranians, I don't know. But I'm not going to assume that it is true. There's also reports that J.D. Vance and Steve Witkoff want to meet with Iranian officials in some place or location somewhere. I've seen some suggest that it should take place in New York, presumably at the United Nations, and that attempts are being made to get the Iranian foreign minister, Mr. Arakchi, to turn up and to meet with Vance and Witkoff at this meeting. Now, I've had an email about potential meetings between the Americans and the Iranians, and I'm going to say that this email came from came from Eve Smith, just to say, one of the most astute and insightful commentators that I know, and she made what I thought was the completely valid and entirely obvious point. The United States has been going around, not the United States, but Israel, with the enthusiastic support of some people in the United States, has been going around assassinating Iranian officials wherever Israel can find them. And the President of the United States himself, as I said, in mob boss style, made a threat to assassinate the supreme leader of Iran. Might it not be considered in Iran extremely unwise for any of their top officials to meet with American officials? Might it not be the case, if they do, that those Iranian officials will only return to Iran in a coffin? Of course, I am sure, I'm absolutely certain, that that is not J.D. Vance or Steve Witkoff's intention. But how can we know? How can we be sure, in the light of what is going on and of the threats that are being made, that that is not how it would turn out? Already, one can see the problems. Anyway, there's been a fine article about all of this on responsible statecraft about Iran supposedly now capitulating to Israeli demands, and American and Israeli demands, giving up its nuclear enrichment program. And it says that after what has happened, it is all but impossible for Iran to do any of these things. If Iran capitulated and agreed to American demands to end its nuclear enrichment program, as night follows day, in light of the events of the last few weeks, the Israelis would say that's not enough. The Iranians must give up their ballistic missiles also. And the Americans, of course, would support them. At least that is what we have seen from the last couple of weeks. That's the lesson that the Iranians will have drawn from the last couple of weeks. And then Iran gives up its ballistic missiles, and then it's expected to give up its air force, its air defense system, its army, one demand following upon another demand, until Iran is left defenseless and Israel attacks and achieves what is its true goal, which is the complete collapse of the Iranian government, if you prefer, the regime. So there is no conceivable way that the Iranians are going to accept any ultimatums at this time. They would be foolish to do so. And statements from Iran, from the Supreme Leader himself, from Ayatollah Khamenei, are now quite clearly stating that they are not prepared to accede to these American demands, that they will not surrender on nuclear enrichment, that Iran remains strong, and that it will remain determined to defend its sovereignty and its independence against American demands that are now unreasonable. Not only unreasonable, but clearly dangerous. So, given that this is so, I cannot see how negotiations between the Americans and the Iranians can now succeed, assuming that they take place, and it's entirely likely, therefore, that with Donald Trump between a rock and a hard place, he's going to take the easy way, and that is to attack Iran. Now, how did we get here? And let me just give my own theory, my own speculation. I've encountered this kind of erratic behavior in the past, in my professional life. I've seen how people can make these incredible, self-destructive, catastrophically ill-judged decisions. I think Donald Trump was persuaded by various people he met. Apparently there was a meeting with various national security advisors and political advisors earlier this month in Camp David, which Donald Trump himself attended, and from which someone arranged to keep Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, excluded. We have this from Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon, by the way, and I have no doubt that they are right. Anyway, there was this meeting there. All of the people who met the president at that meeting were well-known national security hardliners, people who are fully committed to supporting Israel, people who insist upon strong action being taken against Iran and unequivocal and total support for Israel. And of course, as I've discussed in previous programs, Donald Trump has also been meeting with media advocates of a war against Iran, in particular the Fox News commentator Mark Levin. So all of these people met with Donald Trump. Netanyahu and his officials have obviously also been in contact with Donald Trump. And they all told him, look, let's let Israel attack Iran. Iran is fragile. Its government is unpopular. Its military is weak. Israel's air defense system is impenetrable. What will happen is that Israel will attack Iran and the government there will collapse, and will collapse very, very quickly. And then you will have your great success. You will have your big win over Iran. Or if it doesn't happen like that, the Iranians will quickly capitulate and they will agree to your demands. And you will also have your big win on Iran. And the United States doesn't need itself to be directly involved. It can stand back and let these events happen, and you will walk away and you will be well and safe. Now, I don't believe that any of these people who were telling the president this believed a word of it. And I want to say this quite clearly. I believe that they're all drawn from the usual assortment of people who dominate the permanent state of the United States. I think they knew perfectly well, as soon as the operation was launched, that it would be impossible for Israel to destroy the nuclear facilities. And probably they also were aware, at least at some level, that the Iranian government would probably withstand the blow that Israel had exerted against it. But I suspect that that is not what they told Trump. And then, of course, the attack came, and it didn't work out in the way that Trump expected that it would. And now, to his fury and everything about his behavior over the last 2 days suggests a man who is in great fury. To his fury, he finds himself in a position where he is being pressed to support Israel in its attack on Iran. The very thing that apparently he wanted to avoid appearing to do. Otherwise, why create that whole elaborate cover story that it was all an attack on Iran conducted by Israel, by itself? And you could see the signs of anger. He goes to the G7 summit in Canada. He's clearly angry and bored by what goes on there. His mind is always back on the United States. He leaves early. He signs the final communique. He did apparently in the end sign it, but by his own virtual admission, he didn't properly read it and hardly knows what it says. He refused to meet Zelensky. Zelensky was on his way to meet him, but he left before Zelensky came. The Europeans are furious and feel deeply humiliated. He said rude things about Macron, who was telling him, don't go for regime change in Iran. Regime change, of course, is exactly what this whole thing is all about. And on top of that, and beyond all of that, of course, he wasn't prepared to agree sanctions, and he was rude to all the other leaders. And he said that China and Russia should be there too, and it was only if they were there that this meeting would have any real importance. And he whizzed off to Washington, giving everybody the impression that he was needed back in Washington urgently, and that he had to make immediate decisions whilst he was there, except, of course, that he didn't. All that he did was publish the true social messages that I discussed yesterday, and which were also discussed much better than me by Larry Johnson on Sonar 21. And you could see the anger that's still there, the anger in the messages that he published yesterday, the threats against Khamenei. It's entirely normal when somebody knows that they're in a situation that is politically bad for themselves, that is bad for Donald Trump personally in almost every respect, that he lashes out. He can't lash out publicly against Netanyahu, so he's gone against the easy target, which is Khamenei and Iran. He won't, however, pull back. He won't reverse course, because reversing course would be to admit his own folly, the way in which he has been used by the officials of his own administration, the fact that he doesn't really control them, the fact that he doesn't have any kind of policy. So he's going to do the easy thing, or at least what he thinks is the easy thing, which is attack Iran and keep his fingers crossed and hope that it all turns out well, and that what the Israelis were unable to do, which was to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities and to achieve regime change in Iran, the far greater power of the United States will be able to do in its place. And that, I'm afraid, is what they're going to do, what he's going to do. I cannot imagine, as I said, the Iranians capitulating in the way that he clearly wants them to. I can't see him returning to a genuine path of negotiations, whatever he is advised to do by people like Witkoff and Vance. I think that he is now committed to helping Israel, and I think that that is what he's going to do. And though perhaps he balked from making a final decision during the National Security Council yesterday, the logic of events irresistibly pushes him towards that step of attacking Iran. Now, some will say that this is a defense of Donald Trump. I would say again, it is the absolute opposite. I am, by the way, fairly confident that my reconstruction of his mood and actions is correct. I've seen this many times in many people. A president of the United States, somebody who aspires to lead their country, should never let themselves get into a situation of this kind. It would be better if Donald Trump had been in full agreement with all the hardliners, with people like O'Brien and Mike Waltz and all of those people who want to support an attack on Iran. It would mean that perhaps, as I said in previous programs, he might have some control over what is going to happen next, with a chance that he might draw back. I think he has no control at all, and that makes him and the situation far more dangerous for everybody, for Iran, for the United States, for the world, and of course for himself, than it would otherwise be. I cannot imagine a more damning assessment of his actions than the one I've made in this program, just to say. Anyway, there we are. That is what I think is going to happen. I don't know whether it will be in the next 24 hours, but at some point, maybe at the end of this week, we will start to see attacks by the United States upon Iran. Now, there's a long article in the Financial Times today about these massive bombs that the United States has. Apparently, it only has around 20 of them. And it says that these bombs were specifically designed to attack the Fordow nuclear enrichment facility, the one that's buried deep inside the mountain. But the article confirms what I have suspected, which is that there is no guarantee of success. It's not certain that the bombs are powerful enough. There's some suggestions that they might not be, that the facilities in Fordow are buried deeper in harder rock and concrete than the bombs are able to break, that you would need two bombs, one falling directly on top of the other, the hole that the other has created, in order to have any real serious chance of penetration. Now, that is a very complex operation, one which the United States Air Force is probably capable of carrying out. But then, of course, all of that depends on many things, one of which is that the Iranians themselves are not going to take any countermeasures, won't have established any effective defenses around Fordow, will not be able to take action against the bombers as they are conducting the attack. And the only bombers, apparently, that are capable of carrying these bombs are the B-2 bombers. And though they are stealthy, that only means that they are stealthy in relation to radars. There are other ways to detect them, and their huge wingspan means that they are actually a relatively easy target if there are proper air defense systems operating in the area. So this is a complicated, difficult, high-risk operation. It might fail. It's possible that one or two of the bombers might be shot down. And even if everything goes according to plan, it's not definite, it's not certain that the bombs are powerful enough to destroy the Fordow facility. So, I don't know anything about these kind of things. I have no technical knowledge of bombs or explosives or what is needed to break into mountains. I'm not able to comment on this. I don't know anything about the facility in Fordow and how deep it is and how protected it is. So it may be that the chances of success are greater than the Financial Times says. But for what it's worth, that article is there, and its authors clearly have their share of concerns. We'll see. I'm sure that Fordow will be attacked at some point in the next 10 days. I'm sure that the Iranians know that it is going to be attacked at some point over the next 10 days. I'm sure that they're doing everything they feel is needed or that they can realistically do in this very complex military situation that is now playing out to secure and strengthen the facility and perhaps to defend it. We'll just have to wait and see how things play out. If I was Donald Trump, I certainly would not be staking my entire political career on a risk like that. But then I'm not Donald Trump, thank goodness. And as I said, he's now made that decision, whether he realizes it or not. And I don't think he can row back on it. Now, just to also say, perhaps to reinforce how disastrous politically this could all turn out to be, there is a opinion poll which is now public, which shows how unpopular with the American public this operation is. Apparently 60% of Americans oppose the United States involving itself in an attack in Iran, against Iran. Only 24% are not sure, one way or the other. The number of people who gave an answer to this opinion poll who straightforwardly support the attack, an attack on Iran, numbers around 16%. And yesterday, the Federalist, as I said, the intellectual site of the MAGA movement, They broke their silence about this whole crisis by publishing the result of that opinion poll. They've now followed up with an article, a big article today, which says discredited neocon talking points from the Iraq war are back, lazily repurposed for Iran. So they're coming out clearly against this. But let's go back to that opinion poll. If the attack on Iran succeeds, if the nuclear sites are devastated, if regime change follows, perhaps Donald Trump can ride this one out. But if the operation fails, if the United States is caught up in a prolonged war against Iran, then that 60% who say that they are opposed to this war is going to grow, and the political consequences are going to be dire. There'll be protests, there'll be complaints to Congress, there will be a peeling away of support as the president's entire political position becomes consumed by the war, just as was the case with Lyndon Johnson back in the 1960s. Eventually, his position will become threatened, and his ability to lead the United States will be, in my opinion, massively compromised. Opinion polls like this remind me very much of the situation in Britain in 2002, when Tony Blair, a political leader who was even more dominant in terms of the British political scene in 2002 than Donald Trump has been of the political scene in the United States, went against the weight of British public opinion and led Britain into a deeply unpopular war against Saddam Hussein's Iraq. For a while, he was able to pull it off, especially when Saddam Hussein's regime fell. But as the war continued, and it was clear that it was a debacle, his credibility as Prime Minister was shot to pieces. He experienced a heavy loss of support in the 2005 general election, and the following year he was forced to step down. His reputation amongst the British public has never recovered. I think that Trump is on the same slide. I think at some level he probably knows it, but I'm not convinced at this point that there is anything that he can do. Anyway, there we are. We shall see what plays out over the next few days with the United States. Meanwhile, the missile and exchanges between Iran and Israel continue. The Israelis continue to conduct attacks against Iran, targets in Iran. Tehran and Tabriz seem to be particularly heavily targeted. The Israelis also carried out an attack on the nuclear enrichment facilities in Natanz. They claimed that they had managed to penetrate and do damage to some of the enrichment facilities there. And the IAEA, which has now become a loyal republisher of claims made in the West, basically republished those claims and said that they might be true. The Iranians, by the way, deny them. They say that none of their nuclear facilities have experienced any essential damage. The Iranian authorities continue to be as defiant as always. I think it is gradually becoming recognized that the attack on the television station, which, by the way, by some, shall I put it more strongly, by the prevailing view held by most international lawyers, is a war crime. Anyway, that the attack on the television station was a serious mistake. It further infuriated the Iranian public and made the television presenter, a television presenter in Iran, a symbol of national defiance. Even the Financial Times is admitting that, by the way. Anyway, Iran continues to be as defiant as always. It conducted more missile strikes against Israel last night. The Israelis are saying that there were fewer missile strikes than on previous nights. The Iranians are saying the diametric opposite. I'm not able to say who is telling the truth. In either case, some missiles do seem to have got through and do seem to have conducted actual damage. So the war itself continues, and an article has now appeared in the Wall Street Journal which says that Israel is indeed starting to run short of air defense interceptors, specifically the long-range Arrow interceptors. The stockpile of them is depleting in the face of these continuous Iranian attacks. I've been saying that on this channel, and we can start to see that this is exactly what is happening and how it is playing out. Now, the Iranians are saying more. They're saying that if the United States does become involved in the war, then Iran will start taking counter steps against the United States, that they will attack American bases across the Middle East, given that we have seen that Iranian missiles are able to penetrate Israeli air defenses. There's no reason to doubt that they can also penetrate American air defenses. And as Brian Beletic has been pointing out, for a long time now, the United States anyway has a general shortage of air defense interceptors. Production is not keeping up with demand, not even with Ukrainian demand. So if there are missile barrages against American bases across the Middle East, well, it seems to me, based on everything we now know, the Iranian missiles will be able to strike and hit them. Just saying. Anyway, so I can't see any good outcomes here. And Iranian officials have also been making further claims. A former official has spoken about a decision having been made to close the Gulf of Hormuz. I have seen no action by Iran that suggests that anything like that is in fact being done. But we're already getting reports that the Pentagon is worried that the Iranians could start seeding the Gulf of Hormuz with mines, in effect closing it to maritime traffic. And I've even seen some speculation that any American warships that enter the Persian Gulf could find themselves trapped if the Iranians do take those steps, and could themselves, in that case, become targets for Iranian missiles. I'm not going to speculate or discuss these sort of things. This is way beyond my levels of military technical competence. I am not sure what Iranian capabilities are, and I have no knowledge at all of Iranian intentions. Meanwhile, there are lots of reports about the Chinese in particular starting to take their steps. There's been more reports of Chinese aircraft flying to Iran. These are apparently Boeing 747s. of the Chinese airlines. It's speculated they could be cargo aircraft, in which case they might be carrying weapons. But then one does wonder what weapons. And as Brian Beletic pointed out in a live stream we did with him yesterday on the Duran, can Iran, in the very short time that it has these weapons, use them? I mean, usually it takes time to learn, to assimilate and learn how to use weapons, unless, of course, there's been long-standing agreements between Iran and China that we don't know about. One further possibility, which I am going to say, is that it could be that these flights are evacuation flights and that China is taking steps to evacuate its citizens from Iran. That is a possibility that, so far as I know, no one has mentioned, but it is possible. There, of course, continues to be enormous amount of speculation that China is the ultimate target, that after Iran is destroyed, the neocons will turn their attention to China. I have no doubt at all that that is indeed the plan of a large number of people in the neocon and think tank community in the United States. I am going to here express my own opinion. Iran is indeed important for China. It's not been widely noticed, for example, that Iran and China have recently established overland rail links. In fact, just before this attack, a Chinese train traveling from China crossed through Pakistan and entered Iran. It was starting a whole network of travel between China and Iran. Anyway, there is no doubt that Iran is important to China. It's seen as an important economy, one that China could build up and develop. And of course, it's useful. It would be a useful place if it were stable and secure, enabling the Chinese to use Iran as a kind of gateway to the wider Middle East and perhaps to Africa. And of course, Iran does export oil to China, and China has recently become a major importer of oil from Iran. However, though Iran is important to China, I think it is a massive overstatement and frankly entirely wrong to think that Iran is critical to China or indeed to Russia. I think those people who believe that Iran is the keystone of the entire BRICS project are certainly wrong. BRICS has existed for a long time before Iran joined it. Iran only joined BRICS a few months ago, in fact. And I've no doubt that the BRICS can continue without Iran, though in no sense am I trying to understate its significance or the concern that a crisis in Iran would cause to Russia and China. My own view is that the longer the conflict continues, the more likely it becomes that China and Russia will start to take active measures to support Iran. I've discussed in previous programs the kind of active measures that they could take. It all depends ultimately on the stability of the government in Iran. If it collapses over the next few weeks, there's very little that China and Russia can do. If it withstands the blow and maintains its internal cohesion and retains its control of the country, then with every day it will get stronger and it will start to receive more and more support from the other Eurasian powers, and that will tilt the balance of advantage further and further against the Israelis and their American allies. That is my own view. As I said, it ultimately depends on the internal stability of Iran. So far, Iran does appear as if the government is secure and stable, but then, of course, the main blow from the United States has not yet fallen. So we'll just have to see how it is able to deal with that, and what will happen, when it does. Anyway, this is what I'm going to say about this crisis today. One very last thing. The Kremlin has confirmed that Xi Jinping and Putin are going to have a conversation over the next couple of days. I have no doubt that it will be mostly about the situation relating to Iran, the attack on Iran. Both men, both Putin and Xi, have been very busy over the last couple of days. Putin has a long-standing commitment to go to St. Petersburg to attend the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. A key official from China, a member of the Politburo, will be there, and Putin will no doubt be meeting him. But this is an important event in the Russian political and economic calendar, and Putin is hardly in a position to skip it. And I understand, by the way, that Turkey has also sent a very powerful delegation to attend this particular conference in St. Petersburg as well, and Putin undoubtedly will be wanting to speak to them. Xi Jinping has been in Astana in Kazakhstan, where he has been attending a summit of Central Asian leaders. So again, this is an important meeting which Xi Jinping would not have wanted to skip. But as soon as these events are out of the way and each is in their respective capital, we will probably have a telephone conversation. In fact, we will definitely have a conversation between the two, in which will be the contents of which will be made public. We will be provided with readouts, and which will enable them to further coordinate their positions. Of course, in saying this, I should say that I think it's quite likely that Xi and Putin have already spoken to each other since the Israeli attack on Iran, but obviously they will not have had the full panoply of their officials with them, and it's likely that if such a conversation has taken place, it will have been a short one, basically to agree basic positions before the full scheduled meeting over the next couple of days takes place. So China and Russia will coordinate. They will take steps. They are already taking steps. They're certainly working together in the Security Council in the United Nations. But the main burden at the moment falls on Iran. Now, even as all of this continues, the war itself in Ukraine also continues. And Zelensky and his people are apparently deeply upset that Donald Trump didn't meet them in Canada, that he'd already left the G7 meeting in Canada before Zelensky and his people had even arrived there. And I'm going to say it, whatever you may think of Trump's actions over the last couple of days, and I've expressed my own, frankly, I consider scathing views of them. The Europeans, once again, have been completely humiliated, and it shows all across the media in Britain. I appreciate the newspapers tried to suppress it, but social media has been showing it all over the place. And it's appeared, it's starting to appear in even mainstream media now. There is this utterly dreadful photograph of Trump and Starmer after they've supposedly signed the trade deal. Trump has dropped it onto the ground, and Starmer is kneeling at Trump's feet trying to retrieve the papers. It looks awful, and it is awful. And there's been bitter comments about the meeting, the way in which Trump basically stood up all the Europeans, made it quite clear that he wasn't interested in them or in their concerns, and thought that it made more sense for him to be back in Washington. And all of this, as I said, has cumulatively had a very, very bad effect in Europe. Here, perhaps I should explain what I think European attitudes about this conflict between Israel and Iran are. I think all of the European governments, the major European governments, are rooting for Israel to a greater or lesser degree. Some of them, like Friedrich Merz in Germany, are absolutely straightforward about the fact that they support Israel in this conflict with Iran. The fact that this is an attack on a country at peace isn't something that they ever recognize. They continue to insist preposterously that it is Iran that is the major destabilizer of the situation in the Middle East. I mean, a claim that leaves me speechless, given, as I said, that Iran, at the time of the attack upon it, wasn't attacking any country, given the events in Gaza, given the previous Israeli attacks in Lebanon and in Syria. But anyway, never mind. I think that all of the European governments are privately rooting for Israel, but they are concerned again that if the situation in the Middle East leads to a prolonged war that will drag or pull in the United States and lead to a long-term commitment of the United States in the Middle East, a war that will absorb American resources, then the Europeans are worried that this will intensify the process whereby the United States disengages from Europe, drops Europe completely, and leaves the Europeans to their own devices. And that, for the Europeans, continues to be the ultimate nightmare, and it explains some of their hesitation and prevarication about the situation in the Middle East. I think it is explained by nothing more than that. But anyway, the Europeans, utterly humiliated by what happened in Canada at the G7, marginalized, ignored by the United States, left again talking to each other, unable to control or even influence events, and left again to meet with Zelensky and basically to pat him down and to reassure him that they're all behind him and that they remain his friend. Meanwhile, we're getting more news about further Russian advances in Ukraine. And I'm not going to provide here a detailed discussion of those advances again. I hardly think that this is the place to. But we've now had more reports, more explanations about what happened during that major Russian attack on Kiev that took place 2 days ago. This is the attack where the Ukrainians claim that they shot down pretty much everything that the Russians launched at Kiev. Well, not only is that obviously not true, but we're now getting reports that a major warehouse full of ammunition and also large numbers of drones necessary for Ukraine, for Ukrainian troops on the front lines. Anyway, that drone warehouse was completely destroyed, and there is furious anger and recrimination about this in Ukraine, and criticism of the Ukrainian businessman who supposedly posed inside this warehouse with these drones. It said that this gave away the presence of the warehouse with the drones to the Russians, which is quite probably true, by the way. Anyway, the war continues. The Russians are continuing to advance. The situation in Sumy region is getting very bad for Ukraine. It looks as if near Siversk, the village of Serebyanka is about to fall. I say that it's likely the Ukrainians will put up a stiff resistance in Serebyanka. It's generally accepted that we're Verkhokamyanska and Grigorovka and already having fallen, with the Russians having taken Siversk into a kind of semicircle, with the Russians west of Siversk, perhaps occupying Torsk, though the Ukrainians deny it. Anyway, it's generally accepted that if Serebyanka falls, the Ukrainian garrison in Siversk will be in an undefendable position and may be forced to retreat or withdraw, or more likely, given that we're talking about Zelensky and Syrskyi, they will try and stand their ground, and we will see another repetition of the disaster that Ukraine suffered a few months ago in Ugledar, a town which in southern Ukraine filled a similar role as a kind of fortified position that Siversk fulfills in the north, where the Ukrainian garrison was basically told to stand and fight, and then of course it basically fled, and it fled across the fields, the contested fields, and large numbers of men apparently died in those fields, and I suspect it will be the same in Siversk. Anyway, that is one battle amongst many others. The blogger known as Big Serge has published again a massive analysis of the state of the war. He thinks that the big blow, the big Russian blow, is going to come in the Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka area. And he predicts, as many do by the way, that Konstantinovka will be the first of the two to fall. And he thinks that Konstantinovka is becoming undefendable. I'm not going to comment about that. Pokrovsk also looks increasingly undefendable to me. All I would say is this: if Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka do fall, with the Russians now advancing in Kharkiv region too, I cannot imagine a prolonged defense of the other two Donbass cities, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And once they fall, well, the major Ukrainian defenses east of the Dnieper will have gone. But all of this is for further discussion in future programs. This is where I finish my program today. I'm sorry to say this. I believe a war between the United States and Iran is now inevitable. If it is a short war, then it may be that Donald Trump will survive politically, but massive damage will be done, and it will only lead in the end, I expect, to far worse things. If it is a long war, which I think there is a real possibility that it might be, then as I said, it can only end in a geopolitical catastrophe for the United States and for the West, and for the collapse of Donald Trump's administration. That will be, it must be said, the least important of all the things. But I cannot see, talking as I am about the situation today, how this outcome can be prevented. Anyway, this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.